Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. We now officially have merch, so if you're interested in purchasing a shirt, sweater, mug, sticker, or whatever, check out the link in the video description below. Today we're speaking with Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic. We had a great conversation surrounding religion, religious interpretation, how to handle the religious conversation among the religious, really a conversation around all things religion. Drew's a really great guy, so please go subscribe to him and follow him on Twitter. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Always excited to be here.
And we are joined by a special guest here, none other than the fantastic Genetically Modified Skeptic. Drew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's so surreal to have you on.
Well, thanks for that introduction. You know, like if my family, who's honestly a little bit afraid of my YouTube channel, thought of my channel as even half of how you've described it in your introduction, then my life would be a little bit different. So thank you for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's funny because I've sort of met you through the whole Cosmic Skeptic and even Lloyd Evans, Objectively Dan sort of circle. And so I've always considered myself sort of a watcher in that regard. But now that I'm sort of jumping onto the scene, it's so strange to be a part of this fantastic group of people and having conversations with them, because I think the work that you do and that Cosmic Skeptic does is so tremendously important. And I'm afraid I can't put myself out there quite as much as I'd like to yet, because my family, for instance, doesn't know that I'm an atheist or a secularist, and it'd probably break their hearts if they found out. So I'm sort of doing this under the table, hoping that they'll never find out. But it's an absolute honor that we have been considered worthy of your attention. So it's been great to have you here.
Well, I have to say that the way that you're describing where you are is where I felt I was a couple of years ago when I was just starting all of this stuff up. You know, I saw Cosmic Skeptic. I was a big fan of his, and I was a subscriber of his. And I just remember him making like a 20,000 subscriber Q&A special or something like that. And in that, someone asked him how old he was, and he said 17. And I was like, so he's doing this. He's having some success. He's changing some minds, and he's doing this as a 17-year-old. And then like one of the next questions was, how do you film? And it was with my phone. And I was just like, if a 17-year-old can make these kind of waves with a phone, like I have a phone and I'm older than 17, so maybe I can make some waves. But then, yeah, I was just kind of there like, I don't know if I can put myself out there as much as Alex, because my family will freak out if they find out that I'm an atheist. So I ended up telling them before starting a platform, but then I still didn't tell them about the platform until, well, they found it on their own. It was too big to hide at that point.
Yeah.
A complete aside here: if the two of you, as young as you are, can put out content that can help change minds and make for a better world, then an old fossil like myself, who just hit my 4th decade, can almost certainly help make that difference. So I hope you guys have me along for the ride.
Oh, of course.
Well, hey, with the reactions that people can have, people of all kinds, whether they're close to us or whether they're strangers, I'm just happy to have any allies, you know? So having you as an ally in this is fan-freaking-tastic to me. So you are very much welcome to help me out along the way, if not join forces and we can kind of fight this fight side by side, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Glad to have you with us, brother.
Yeah, it's a shame that I couldn't meet you at the Freedom from Religion Foundation that was occurring in San Francisco. Unfortunately, university really screwed me over right there, so I wasn't able to attend. But I mean, I managed to meet Cosmic Skeptic Alex O'Connor at the Logical event in Los Angeles, and spoke very highly of you. So that's always fantastic.
Oh, that's
and
nice.
Yeah, so it's great that we can finally meet each other. How have you been dealing with the pandemic?
I mean, honestly, at first it was just, so I was planning, I won't spoil it all because a lot of the stuff's still going to happen, but I was planning some big things with my channel. And basically a couple of days before I was going to launch this whole thing, which included like kind of redoing my Patreon and making a video about that and all that kind of stuff, my city went on lockdown, and I was like, oh, okay. Well, I've been quarantining already, but now I'm realizing that everyone everywhere is going to be quarantining, shutting down. I was just like, you know what? This is not the time to do a whole big relaunch and be like, hey, come support me on Patreon, buy some merch, stuff like that. And so I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to just put it off until this is all over. About a month later, no signs of any of it going away. And so I realized that if I wanted to relaunch anything with my channel and make things bigger and better, I was going to have to do it gradually, using all the time I have, rather than having more resources and then paying people to help me out. So essentially, it went from me not knowing what to do and kind of slacking off for like an entire month, and now me being like, okay, let's kick today's ass, get this stuff done. I don't have the money to pay people to help me out as much, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in triple the work and get more done. So that's what we're doing, and my next video hopefully will show that. My last one, having Tierzu in it, I was really excited about. And yeah, just pushing for bigger and better things now that we're over the slump of stagnation depression, if that can be a phrase.
Absolutely. Drew, we met just under 2 years ago at the Freedom from Religion event in San Francisco. Vince and I were supposed to come up there together, but our schedules unfortunately didn't quite align. I had the pleasure of speaking to you and Telltale along with Mohammed Syed, Sarah Hyder, Muhammad Al-Qadra, who was absolutely phenomenal when we met him.
Yeah.
I've noticed that you've been very active in the community as of late. You've been to Israel with our mutual friend Armin Navabi, and you've even worked to raise funds for ex-Muslims of North America. And it's fantastic that you don't limit your activism solely to dealing with the Christian fundamentalists, which is phenomenal, and you've inspired many people to speak out openly, myself included. There is unfortunately no shortage of battles to be fought against bad ideas. I know you can't tell us anything about like what you have, anything you have necessarily come up in your channel, but where do you see yourself going large scale in the future? Like where do we take this battle as time goes on, especially in light of COVID-19, especially in terms of the upcoming election, which could very well result in conservative dominance in the Supreme Court, which is a disaster, perhaps. And it just sounds like we may be in for for a war ahead.
Yeah. So when I started all of this, the atheist and skeptic community had kind of splintered into two different political factions, which were the SJW and the anti-SJW. And the atheist skeptic community, as far as being on YouTube, there wasn't really a whole lot of progress being made. There was a lot of drama, there was a lot of vitriol, but there was very little substance, I felt. And then along came Cosmic Skeptic and Holy Kool-Aid and Paulogia, and like a lot of these great channels who are my friends now and were people who were just inspiring me then. And I thought, you know what, I need to get into this battle. I need to get into this and spread my ideas around, contend with difficult or potentially harmful ideas to hopefully help some people believe as many true things as possible and as few false things. And I kept fighting that fight and eventually got to the point where I gained more influence than I ever anticipated, because this was supposed to be literally a channel for me to vent through, to share my ideas. And it eventually became something to where it was like an influence, a power of influence I had over an audience. And it wasn't just about me expressing what I wanted to say or what I felt like I needed to say. It became about what people needed to hear, what people needed to learn, what people needed to know. And so my role from the very beginning has shifted. It used to be about kind of, if we're going with this like battle or fight analogy, it was more hand-to-hand combat, right? Now I am, I hate to say this term, but I'm a little bit of a recruiter, right? My content is going more in the direction of funneling people in to this kind of way of thinking or into this community where these ideas are being put up against each other, so that they can be a part of that battle. They can be a part of that conversation. There's a lot of people who don't have hundreds of thousands of subscribers that are making content that is incredibly valuable. And if there are eyes looking at it and ears listening to it, it will change something within them. I didn't really feel like that was a big thing in 2016, 2017 before me and some of my peers started revamping atheist YouTube to the best of our ability. And now, yeah, we have that foundation. If I can literally, if someone wants to know about fallacies, or they want to know about ex-Muslim issues, or they want to know about human rights crises or whatever, I have places to send them. And so for me, I guess it's just because of how I like to do things, what I prefer to do, what people prefer to watch. I don't know exactly, but my channel has gotten in front of more eyes than I anticipated it in, so I'm using that to my advantage and to the community's advantage. I'm kind of wanting to act as a funnel to interest people who might not be interested in this if they saw the hard content, the hard hitting. If they watch secular jihadists, they wouldn't be super into it. But if they listen to what I have to say, and then I say, go watch secular jihadists, go listen to them, go listen to what Ali Rizvi and Armin Navabi are saying about this human rights issue, then someone goes, oh, well, I watched this video that kind of had themes of science fiction and some general human rights talk, and it was interesting. There was a lot of narrative and good editing, and it captured my attention, and now I realize that I'm kind of enveloped in this battle of ideas, and I can choose whether or not to take up arms. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do now. Basically, that means I'm trying to appeal to more people without sacrificing any of the values that I've always had.
Yeah, you brought up something interesting right there that we can probably navigate this conversation towards, and that is the sort of split in the atheist community that occurred. So atheism sort of took a dive in popularity. If we're just judging strictly by Google searches and the general feel of the intellectual landscape, atheism probably had its peak around 2012, and then now it sort of took a dip. Oh, what do you think happened? Do you think that we just simply won the battle against creationism, or is it just no longer sort of cool and punk to be an atheist now?
I think it's a little bit of both, but there's another explanation there. So it depends on what space you're in. If you're on Facebook and someone posts something particularly Christian or particularly atheistic, the Christians or the theists are more likely to have that battle just because of their numbers. Now, if you're on Twitter or if you're on YouTube or if you're on Reddit, Reddit can be a little unfortunate. But if you're on a lot of social media platforms, atheists win. Sometimes, unfortunately, there are so many atheists that come out in places like YouTube comment sections that it doesn't matter if the atheists make good arguments. They can overwhelm people by just sheer numbers and by being vitriolic, which I don't approve of, but in a way that's a form of winning against creationists. I mean, if you post a creationist video, like for instance, I made a video responding to creationism, like a creationist country song a long time ago, like 2 or 3 years ago. Now that video has like 1 million views. The video I was responding to at the time had 1,000 views. Now that same video, just because I linked it in my description, has over 11,000 dislikes alone. And so it's like just because of sheer numbers, because of us congregating in a certain way, in certain places of the internet, we have defeated things like creationism. That said, I don't think that that's the thing that really made atheism start to tank when it came to at least its popularity on YouTube, or its view as something that was cool, or like you said, punk rock, and I really think that was just due to what every ideological group tends to do at some point. You get enough people together that are loosely kind of kept together by this glue of an ideology or of a specific idea, and depending on how firm that glue is, determines exactly how long until this group starts to splinter into more and how violently it does so. Now, I'm sure you guys have had to explain, atheism is simply a lack in the belief in any gods. There's nothing more to that. So our glue is not that strong. And in fact, a lot of people that are atheists or would be atheist types when there is stigma around it still, especially like in the United States, we kind of tend to be jackasses sometimes. We're very rebellious and hard-headed a lot of the time. At least that's the kind of personality that a lot of the time falls into these groups. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not really optimal for keeping a group together for super long. Unfortunately, that puts us at a disadvantage as far as making cohesive groups as compared to religious groups. So I think what ended up happening is a bunch of people got together on surrounding the ideas of, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. It's just the four horsemen, and that was the glue holding us together for a while. Eventually, a lot of people realized that atheists had very different political leanings depending on who they were. And those political leanings ended up being the dividing line that people, split off, along which they split off. And you kind of ended up having people that were strong progressives, or you could even say regressives, depending on what your thoughts are on that. And then you had people that were like anti-SJWs. You could call them centrists, you could call them rational, you could call them too far to the right, you could call them extreme, reactionary, whatever you want to call them. We did end up having those factions split off. And eventually I think that people like Cosmic Skeptic and like I know myself, Holy Kool-Aid, a lot of people who came along around 2016, 2017 had just been sick and tired of anytime we say we're an atheist, people assume that we're either kind of an extreme leftist, or we are the rational centrist who thinks he's cooler than everyone and smarter than everyone else and has read so many books and loves Jonathan Haidt, so you must be an idiot compared to me. I think we got really tired of being put in either of those camps, and we were like, no, I just want to be able to continue the conversation that we started in the End of Faith. I want to be able to continue the conversation that the God delusion kind of brought up. I want to be able to continue the conversation that God's not great might have spurred within us. Unfortunately, we're not talking about that anymore because we can't stop talking about just political issues. So we decided to say, screw that. We're going to not just dive into politics. We're going to dive into, I guess, what the Four Horsemen may have started, but we did it in our own way. And I think that a prevailing theme among a lot of the creators that are my peers, my contemporaries, is realizing how susceptible we are to tribalism, how susceptible we are to splitting off and splintering exactly the same way as any religious group, and checking ourselves before we wreck ourselves. So there's a lot of more empathy involved, I think. Empathy is the thing that's hopefully keeping us from splintering for longer than previous groups have. That's not to say that splintering will happen at some point.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone put it in quite so eloquent a way anymore, but that's really that's something I think we should all think very, very deeply about. We had Dr. Michael Shermer on our podcast a few weeks ago, and I finished reading his newest book, Giving the Devil His Due, and one of the more powerful points he made inside there is that if we want to win more people over, then it's not enough to declare what it is we're against so much as what it is we stand for. And in that bucket of things that we stand for is empathy, is compassion, is understanding, and even and of course social justice from a rationalistic standpoint. Because one of the things that we often talk about is the need for our morals to be grounded on some kind of objective basis to move forward into a more humanistic future. So it's really unfortunate that we have that atheists are kind of viewed with that kind of asshole perspective, but to some degree, perhaps it's been earned, and perhaps that interferes with the work that really needs to be done.
I have to say that it's a lot easier to get work done and rally people around a cause if there is a more clear-cut goal, if there is something that, especially if there is something that you're working against, almost like you're unifying in order to oppose like a common enemy. And now I think that it's really easy to make other people our common enemy, and I think that that's what the atheist community of, or at least the atheist YouTube community of the past tended to do a lot, especially with reaction videos, you know, like Ken Ham is our enemy, Ray Comfort's our enemy, Kent Hovind's our enemy, Nephilim Free, like Venom Fang X, all of the creationist types, those are all our enemy, and we wanted to destroy them and erase their channels from existence. And now I don't think so much of them as my enemies as so much as my interlocutors. Now, I do think that there's definite harm that people like that bring about, but I'm more focused on the ideas. Yes. And if I'm going to rally people around anything, and if they're going to treat anything as a common enemy, for me, the thing that I'm rallying people around is what people like me used to be, and which is something that is, I think, spitting in the face of an opportunity to influence people for the better in favor of more views, more vitriol, and I don't know, maybe more, I don't want to call it sadistic, but more self-centered fun, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's fun to try to wreck creationists. It's fun to troll people. It's fun to all that stuff. And I'm not saying that that's all, you know, the atheist community of the past did, or, you know, any of that. They're definite. I'm still standing on the shoulders of giants, I suppose. But there are a lot of things that I think that we've made mistakes about. And if we're going to rally against something, it needs to be something that we're not going to be hurting. It's not going to cause damage to other people. It's not going to shoot ourselves in the foot if we aggressively attack what we consider our enemy. I think that it's useful to consider our enemy our mistakes of the past, rather than the people that we're looking at right now in the present making mistakes that we want to correct. Does that make sense?
Yes, and what else are we arguing for than for a better future than the person sitting across the table from me, as well as the world as a whole? But
exactly.
You gave me the perfect opening to the next question I have for you. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, but well, this is an interesting next question I have for you. I usually see your name come up in the same circles that mention some of the new up-and-comers like Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic, and Stephen Woodford, Rationality Rules. It's been some time since the original 4 members of the new atheist movement really kickstarted the conversation against religion and religious fundamentalism, and their efforts really were the spark that lit the fire. It really tuned up the battle of ideas that we now face in the 21st century. With the exception of Sam Harris, the other two are getting up there in age, and I've often asked myself, like, who do we really have to carry the torch in their absence? Especially as we all know, this battle of ideas is not going to be over anytime soon. Speaking for myself, with the quality of the conversations the three of you put out, and the investiture in your ideas, and the willingness to put it on the line in debate and engagement, I see the movement moving forward in a healthy fashion into the future, especially with this compassionate approach that you really want to bring across. Overall, where do you see the whole atheist / humanist / enlightenment movement going?
It's
a big question.
It is a big question. I kind of wonder if, because I've had people say, you know, there's like Harris, Dennett, and Dawkins still left, and you know, Hitch, God rest his soul, needs a replacement. Pun intended. Needs a replacement. And people have said a lot, like Alex, Cosmic Skeptic, is going to be Hitch's replacement. You know, he's going to be the person that rises up and you know, bears that torch, carries that torch along from where Hitchens left off. And while I actually do think that Alex is perfectly capable, more than capable, of doing exactly that, I do wonder if the path that we want to go down strays from having central figures and has less to do with elevating a few in order to represent the many, and has more to do with empowering the many so that they can do even more than those few ever did in their time. So by that, I'm saying it used to be that just some atheists had YouTube channels. right? That there was a few atheist YouTube channels. Like if you were subscribed to The Amazing Atheist, you knew about Jack and Glenn, you knew about Cult of Dusty, you knew about like everyone. You knew about everybody. Now, it's kind of gotten to the point where every few weeks, or at least every month or so, I see some name follow me on Twitter. It looks like not just a regular account, but like a brand. I click on it. Yep, this is a new person that just made an atheist YouTube channel, and they're saying a lot of the points that I've touched on. Sometimes they're new points, sometimes they're points I've made, but they're like put in different ways for different people. And from the beginning, my goal as a YouTuber was always to spread these ideas around so much, including the ideas of that getting on YouTube and spreading these ideas is important, that I wanted to put myself out of business. I wanted to saturate this market so much that my channel has to change. If I make a video about Pascal's wager, I want everyone to look at that, scoff, and say, we've already heard all of it. This isn't going to teach us anything. This is ridiculous. I want something more. I want something new and innovative and challenging. And I kind of think that we're getting to that point. I want us to go even further. I want videos that I've made recently to seem old and simplistic and outdated, because there are people who have been making YouTube videos for a month that are saying the same things as I am. It doesn't take a big platform. It doesn't take a person who would rise to the top in a competitive environment to get these ideas out there. I want everybody to have their YouTube channel, everybody to have their platform, nobody to be afraid of speaking about these things, so that we don't have to have figures that we follow, and then when they mess up, we splinter off because we either approve of their actions or don't approve of their actions. Or, I think that we fall into tribalism maybe even easier when we elevate a certain figure above ourselves. Now, there is use for hierarchy. There's use for kind of representative democracy, essentially. But if we can educate people to the extent that no one has to elect a representative in order to speak for themselves articulately, then yeah, that's the goal. That's exactly what we want. So when new podcasts, when self-published authors, when new YouTubers come about, I'm like, this is one step closer to putting me out of business, and that's exactly what I want. I would love to just go get a job working in an office, because you can't make videos about atheism anymore and make money because everyone does it, everyone knows about it.
That's an interesting take. So the people like Hitchens, Dawkins, and Sam Harris were the catalyzing enzyme for representation within the atheist community, but at this point, now the representation is everybody else just stepping up, taking up the mantle for their own, and having conversations with themselves. I think that's certainly interesting. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And you mentioned earlier in the podcast sort of the fact that atheism really is just nothing more than the lack of belief in a God, or in the Abrahamic faith specifically, I suppose. But there's also another strand of atheists that really propped up, and that is the anti-theist crowd, the people who, for lack of a better word, simply thought that society would be better off without religion. And I'm aware that you yourself took up sort of that position back in the day, and I'm not sure if you still take up that position. Are you still an anti-theist, and how do you distinguish the difference between atheism and anti-theism?
That's a good question, and it's one that if people get a hold of this, there's going to be a lot of people that are mad at me and a lot of people that are happy about it. So I don't really hold to that label now. At least I don't use that label. Now, it's not so much my positions that have changed completely. There's been some changes to my positions, but it's mostly the usefulness of that word having really diminishing returns for me that keeps me from using that word anymore. So one of my polytheist friends says that he wishes he could tell the difference between anti-theists and anti-theists. And what he means by that is that there are people who uphold the religious liberties of everyone. They do not discriminate. They don't treat people with bigotry. And like when people express their religious ideas to them, they're not calling them mentally ill, mocking them, calling them names. They are kindly disagreeing with them, but respecting their right to be able to do and believe that, as long as they're not hurting others. That's the kind of person I would say that I am. But then there are anti-theists who do all the things that I said that is not desirable kind of to my polytheist friend. And I don't think those are desirable behaviors, at least in representing something that I say I stand for. which is, secularism and futurism, humanism. So I don't use the word anti-theist anymore. I think that now I more specifically say that I'm fighting against religious harm. And that's what I meant as anti-theist in the past when I used that label really explicitly. Now that label tends to backfire a little bit because people will assume that I think that this thing is harmful when I don't think that it's actually that harmful, but I don't believe in it. And then it just starts this whole conversation that has me backtracking and restating a bunch of positions that I never said that, never really said that I had, but people assumed. So now I'd say I oppose religious harm. So that means basically dogma. That means beliefs that, if acted upon, cause the physical, mental, emotional harm of other people, that set back our political structures, several decades, if not a few hundred years, if you could, depending on exactly what you're talking about. I still fight against those things. I just don't necessarily use that label. Now, something that I will be putting out here on my channel, I think people will be noticing, and I will probably have some people unsubscribing, but some new people subscribing when I do this, is I'll be speaking about how I think that people like Emil Durkheim and Jonathan Haidt are correct when they say that, to a certain extent, human beings evolved to be religious. And that they're basically acting religious to a certain extent is a beneficial mutation, the beneficial adaptation that we have. It allows us to form into more cohesive groups. It helps us cooperate better. It's all about cooperation, really. But I don't necessarily think that means that every part of that adaptation, first of all, is even an adaptation. Some of it, I think, has to do with pernicious memes, memetics. That's the kind of Dawkins and Dennett idea. But then I also think some of the adaptations that we act according to are kind of outdated. I think that being particularly tribal and trusting your inner circle is great when you are a hunter-gatherer that is in a faction of 30 people, and anyone that ever tries to come into your group could potentially either mooch off your group or kill people in your group. Being tribal, being really suspicious of new people, new ideas, those are all great things in that context. Now, if you take that psychology that we naturally fall into that was evolved 100,000 years ago and put it into a Twitter conversation, you have a recipe for an absolute shit show. And it doesn't, a lot of the adaptations that we have don't make sense for us living in a global society peacefully. I think that some of those adaptations have to do with religious structures. They uphold religion, but they don't necessarily uphold what we need to survive, what we need, the structures and the communities that we need to create a better future for everyone. Mm-hmm. So I'm against religious harm, and even in a way, I oppose us acting according to what I consider somewhat part of our nature. I'm kind of asking people to defy their natures, to evolve in their minds because they can't evolve biologically fast enough.
Yeah.
And I don't feel that position is communicated with the word anti-theist as well anymore. Mm-hmm. So that's why I don't tend to use it.
Oh, that's
well, evolutionary sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, yeah. That's interesting, and that opens up the conversation about the potential maladaptation of religion. Whereas originally it was generally considered as an adaptation from the work of Jonathan Haidt, as you said, even Paul Bloom to some extent. And yeah, I agree that unfortunately there's some bad actors when it comes to the label of anti-theism. For me, I've always associated the term anti-theism as nothing more than viewing religion as a net negative on society. And so for that reason, that's what I've always considered myself an anti-theist. But I can certainly sympathize with the fact that you want to isolate yourself from people who would use it to just sort of bash religion, call religion a mental illness, refer religious people as stupid. That's certainly not the route I want to take, and it's definitely something that I also want to distance myself from. As you were saying, Bruce?
Well, it definitely seems like evolutionary psychology has definitely given a lot of us those traits that would make humans religious. And I definitely agree with you there, Drew. So my concern, though, is like, are those traits necessarily maladaptive for where we are right now in this period in time? Because the tribalism we are divided into has really terrible consequences for how we interact today. We see people basing their epistemologies almost entirely on their tribe, and that's just poison in political and any other kinds of social climates.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that some adaptations that we have as that I would consider to be a part of like this religious set of ideas, I think some of those adaptations, or set of adaptations, I think some of those adaptations are outdated and they tend to be kind of a net negative when we act upon them. If we could rewire our brains, reprogram our brains to not be adapted in that way, I think that we would probably be better off in the world that we're living in right now. And then I think that there are some that don't necessarily have to hurt us. They can be beneficial as long as we understand that these adaptations are there. For instance, we tend to respond really, really strongly to ritual. We like ritual, tradition, communal gatherings that allow us to bond with people, to like solidify our identity, to feel safe and protected, have a sense of security. I think I would consider that something that adaptation, that love of ritual, to be something that's involved in like the religious set of adaptations, right? I think that those are like, that's not necessarily or inherently a bad thing. I think that that's a good thing if used correctly. Ritual is in a way, it's a kind of psychological technology that can be used for good or it can be used for bad. And I think the crazy thing is, though, is that we are just now really realizing in the world of science that structures that play upon these adaptations that we hold within us, those are a technology. Religions, organized religions, are a technology. And we've been using them without realizing exactly what they were capable of, what their power was, and where they came from. And now we're just now getting to the point where we do know a certain limited amount of all of those things. And we're trying to take hold of this like bucking bull, right? And we're trying to ride it instead of actually controlling it and letting it do what we want. Now, it's kind of the whole Prometheus giving fire to humanity, and humanity can burn itself or can create civilization with this fire. Now, obviously, in the story, people create humanity, and things turn out mostly good, not for Prometheus, but for humanity. Now, I think that we're discovering that religion is the fire, right? At least a lot of our psychology that buys into religion or plays into religion is the fire. It's a technology that we could potentially use for good. The problem is that it's also really, really easy to let it completely get out of control, burn us, and it's done that many, many, many times to the point where we're wondering whether or not we should live in a world without fire, or maybe we should tame it to the point where we all are doing no more than carrying candles around.
And it's a very, very tricky road to navigate because in a conversation that Brett Weinstein had with Sam Harris, I think there may have been someone in the audience asking him if this was some kind of mechanism of the human condition that could be overridden. But he made the point that the same the same technology that evolutionary psychology has cursed us with is what gives rise to the evil that is in fundamentalist religious practices. But on the flip side, that same technology is what allows us to bind together. Is what allows us to really enjoy being part of a group that celebrates a certain football team. So it's very, very hard to thread through that. But something I wanted to run past you. Someone on Twitter, the bastion of reasonable conversations, referred to anti-theism as bigotry towards religious people, when in reality, I view it as an assault against bad ideas and not specifically towards the people involved in religion as a whole. Yeah. The three of us are very familiar with the issues in Islamic fundamentalism, and we know there's a difference between discussing Islamic ideas and genuine anti-Muslim bigotry, which is totally evil in itself. and we know this extreme difficulty in being able to thread the needle um, between bigotry and ideas themselves. But there's also a problem with the religious Christian groups claiming oppression whenever challenges are posed to fundamentalism and other crazy practices. And it's a fine line to walk between the dual clauses in the First Amendment, between not respecting a religion and not enforcing a state religion. And I'm butchering what I'm saying here, but it's a fine line walking between the two aspects in the First Amendment. In your work against against the bad ideas in religion, like have you had to carefully draw the line between recognizing when someone is calling is pointing out that they're being oppressed because of their religion, and simply being attacked because they don't really understand the First Amendment? Like, have you ever had to walk those two lines? Walk between those two lines?
Yeah, there are people that think that respect of their person is something that entails absolute impunity from any kind of criticism of any of their ideas. There are people that think that. A lot of the time, I think the people that think that are those who have been raised in really extreme religious privilege. So I was raised in pretty extreme religious privilege, being a fundamentalist Christian in Texas. I thought that when I went on forums when I was a teenager, and people would say something about not being Christian or just saying something about being anything other than Christian, I thought that was super offensive. I thought that was totally outside of what was allowable, what was okay, and yeah, I thought it was something that maybe should not be allowed legally. It's embarrassing to say that, but I was there as a 15-year-old. That's the mindset that I was in, and there are people that are out there that still think that kind of thing. Now, my approach to those kinds of people tends to just be, a lot of what you're thinking is based on assumptions. You've been told certain things about people like me and about the things that people like me say. You've been told a lot about our motivations. Let me take you in and show you that those assumptions are not some that you have to hold to, and it really is okay to contend with me, to listen to what I'm saying, realize that I'm a human being just like you. We can have a calm, comfortable, well, maybe not super comfortable, but we can have a calm conversation where we can go over these topics and we can realize I'm not trying to disrespect you as a person. I'm not trying to belittle you. I'm not trying to demean you. I'm not trying to put you any lower than myself, and you're not. These ideas, though, need to be able to fight it out. And sometimes we put ourselves in the way of that. I'll try not to put myself in the way of that, my own selfish interests in the way of having these ideas compete, if you'll help me do that, if you'll join me in doing that. Now, not everyone responds to that. Some people think that is belittling or patronizing, or they're still suspicious of me, or the assumptions just don't disappear. But for a lot of people, that does seem to actually work. Now, an approach, I think the reason why I take that approach, one that has a lot more kind of empathy and patience, and to use a Christian term, really long suffering, I think that I actually take inspiration from the fact that there were so few people around 2007, 2008 that were taking the, what would you even call the approach, the empathic approach to deconversion or to discussing these ideas, and we took more of the firebrand approach. Now, I don't think that the firebrand approach should be off limits. I don't think it necessarily is not useful. I think that in times when basically effectively a religious minority is being trampled under the foot of an oppressive majority, like atheism, humanism was being trampled under Christian fundamentalism in the United States, and
Yes.
Islamic fundamentalism more in the Middle East, we need to speak up and kind of be like, you know what, fuck you. And fuck this. We can speak up, and we're going to, and if you're upset about that, then that's too damn bad. We do have to speak up and do that sometimes. But in encounters with individuals where that power dynamic doesn't exist so much, I think that we can take a more nuanced, more patient more, you call it loving approach. It really depends case by case. Now, I do know people who call anti-theism bigotry, and what they mean by that is a different definition of anti-theism than I think any of us would say that we've ever held to, which is, I'm an anti-theist, so I think that you should, like, not necessarily be locked up, but I think that you should be openly mocked, ridiculed in public, like Richard Dawkins said at the Reason Rally in 2012. You know, we should make fun of you. You suck. There are anti-theists who just think that. I don't necessarily know that they're in the majority. I think that Twitter comments might make you think that, but I think the people who genuinely actually call themselves anti-theists and sit down and have a conversation with you, I don't think they're that way. I just think that Twitter trolls are trolls, and they call themselves anti-theists sometimes. But I know religious people, and I have some religious friends who call anti-theists bigoted or bigots, or say anti-theism is inherently bigoted because that is the experience that they've had. Is just the trolls. They've never had an actual insightful dialogue with someone like I think hopefully one of us would be able to have with them, and be like, you know, I might call myself an anti-theist, or I have at some point, but I can respect you as a person, and we can discuss these ideas without bringing, you know, personal emotional concerns into it. And that's kind of where my polytheist friend says that he wishes he could tell the difference between anti-theists and anti-theists. Because in this hand, you have people that aren't worth having a conversation with, and in this hand, you have people that are more than worth having a conversation with. And unfortunately, sometimes they use the same label, and it can be hard to tell when you're on something like social media. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're in person, it's a lot easier to tell.
I'm completely with you there, because but it's not always easy for me to tell when it's time to have an engaging conversation in depth, and when to rely on the hammer of justice that is aggressive argumentation. Someone I know who in my opinion does this fairly well, who threads the needle with a fair amount of skill, is someone like Seth Andrews, for instance. But I remember what comes to mind right now is a video that you recently made responding to a hero of yours when you were a fundamentalist Christian. And I was getting angry watching that video, because he was just mocking you. And what really inspired me, to tell you the truth, was how you were responding to him, not to refute his points, but as to essentially present an example of human decency, which is when it comes down to it, something that we're all fighting for. Decency, respect, and the kind of humanism that you and I and Vincent and everyone else here would like to see in a better world.
Yeah. So the approach behind that video was really, it was that funnel approach that I was discussing earlier. The content is there. If you want to talk about how I became an atheist, the content is there. If you want to talk about evolution, which Kent Hovind likes to fight me on, then yeah, you can go learn about evolution on YouTube. You can go watch debates between him and other people, and him and other people who know more about evolutionary biology than I do. They're there. What's not there as much is a figure or a force that is humanizing atheists in the eyes of people who have been taught to dehumanize them, to strip their humanity away and consider them just noise out there that you know needs no mind paid attention to it. And I was just really trying to put myself out there. I knew that reaction video would get people to watch, and they'd be like, okay, this is an old school smackdown, like a 2012 atheist versus creationist response video. This is going to be multiple videos. This is going to be a big event. A bunch of people are going to talk about it. It's going to be going on in podcasts. It's all this stuff. It's going to be a smackdown, and I can't wait to see the bloodbath. But instead, you click on it, and I'm not responding to his arguments. I am just trying to show my character, I suppose. I'm trying to show people who need to be emotionally convinced that there are atheists that should be taken seriously and are worth trusting. I'm trying to show people that those people exist. Like, I try to be one of them. I'm not going to say that I'm someone should be listened to all the time or something. Of course, like and subscribe, support me on Patreon. You better not miss a video, ring the bell, all that stuff. But no, I'm not going to say that like you should hang on my every word or anything. I just think that if you watch what I've put out there, I think I've made a pretty decent case for, I think that sometimes this atheist has good intentions, good motivations for putting this information out there. They're not trying to hurt me. They're not trying to hurt anyone. They're not just trying to be right. They're not trying to stroke their ego in front of however many people watch the video. They're trying to put something out there so that hopefully their friends and family who have put them at arm's length will realize, will have less of a reason to put them at arm's length. They'll have more of a reason to humanize them and see them as a peer, a contemporary, someone that can be spoken to and trusted and even believed. And that's what I'm trying to do. With that video, I was trying to break down emotional barriers more than intellectual barriers. Because if I can break down that emotional barrier, which is honestly probably a lot stronger, then the intellectual barriers can be just completely broken through and demolished upon the view of content that already exists, either on my channel or on Rationality Rules, Stephen Woodford's channel, on the Thinking Atheist podcast, on Alex O'Connor's Cosmic Skeptic's channel, on you guys' podcast. The episode with Michael Shermer was excellent, and that's a place. It's another resource that people can go to break down intellectual barriers. But I'm trying to work on emotional barriers because I think that's something that even more people have.
Mm-hmm. That's good, and breaking down that emotional barrier is a good way to get rid of what Brett Weinstein referred to as the imposter problem. So, for instance, on the topic of anti-theism, your friend who said you can't tell the difference between an anti-theist and an anti-theist, so there's an imposter problem there where because you have two completely different modes of thinking, but they both label themselves as an anti-theist. It's like, well, what's a real anti-theist? And so, I want to sort of change the direction of this conversation towards, I still keep it within the domain of religion, but shift it more towards the cultural side of it and scriptural interpretation and what is probably the most accurate and honest interpretation of scripture. So there are some people out there, for instance, that associate religion not so much with the supernatural aspect of it, but rather with tradition and rituals and family and community. You'll see people like David Wolpe and Jonathan Haidt be proponents of this view. But do you think that this sort of view, the prioritization of the sort of cultural aspect of it rather than the literal fundamental aspect of it, sort of dilutes what the text was originally intended for in the first place? Or do you view it as a healthy alternative to fundamentalism? Because the way I'm always concerned about is that, of course, I would say that it's probably a healthy alternative to fundamentalism, but at the same time, it's sort of at the expense of getting an accurate understanding of what the philosophies of the people who wrote it at the time were.
Yeah, in the question, you have represented what I would say in my answer. Really, I think that it's worthwhile to, like, let's say that there is a pro-LGBT Muslim out there, and I mean there are. It's not just hypothetical. There are pro-LGBT Muslims who are progressive. They believe in human rights. They uphold that. They have egalitarian values. They're not stuck in a culture from 1400 years ago exactly when it comes to human rights. And I want to encourage that. I want to say that is a healthy alternative to fundamentalism. The problem there is that I don't want your influence to betray the fact that the ideology that you are saying that you belong to may have started out as nothing more than an attempt to grab power in the Arab world through religion and cultural conquest. So it's kind of like I have this image of myself seeing a pro-LGBT church, let's say like a United Methodist Church that's rebelled against the United Methodist Church and decided we're going to be pro-LGBT instead of anti-LGBT like our, like governing body has told us to be. I have this image of me bursting in there and saying, I'm telling you guys, this is great. I'm glad you're pro-LGBT. I'm glad you're upholding human rights. I'm glad you're voting basically in the same way as I am. I'm glad that you're not denying science. But can you not call yourself a part of the Christian tradition? Because the Christian tradition historically has caused the death of so many innocent people and has caused the abuse of the human rights of even more. So why are you trying to stick to this tradition, or why are you associating with this at all anymore? Why don't you name yourself something different? Why don't you cut yourself off completely from this? And I realize that if I jump into that church and I proclaim that, well, what's going to happen? The people could just get mad at me, throw me out, not really think much about it. But if they do think about what I said, there could potentially be a division between the people who want to keep the Christian name and maybe some of the Christian traditions alive, but not the bigotry part. And then there are people who would not necessarily want to keep the Christian name and keep their more progressive ideals. That could potentially make that church split into two. There could be more division there. And ultimately, that the division between those people would be based upon what they call themselves. And I just don't know if me bursting into the church in order to cause that division would be worth anything. And I'm not saying that I know that me bursting in there and telling them that they shouldn't identify as whatever, because they're helping some, big, massive industrial complex system of, religious bigotry. I don't know if I burst in there and tell them that they're doing that's going to actually be beneficial, or if it's just going to hurt them in the long run. Maybe I should just stay out completely. And I don't have an answer to what is the right decision, if I should burst in or not. But it's something that's on my mind all the time. And I think it's something that, if you watch my videos very closely, you can see me wrestling with that a little bit. Hopefully there's an answer out there. I don't know if anyone has found it. Maybe there's a lot of people who have beat me to the punch, and I hopefully can catch up. I don't know. If you guys figure it out, let me know.
I don't have it figured out for sure. One of the things that always is sort of stationed in the back of my head is this idea that one of the values that we need to hold on to if we want to live into the next 200 years is intellectual honesty. And so it's one of those things where, as much as I applaud the fact that there could be pro-LGBT hardcore Christians out there, it concerns me that they're doing that at the expense of their intellectual honesty, and how long is that going to survive into the future? And so, as you said, I don't have an answer to that question. But the best thing that I can do is, pardon the shameless plug, think out loud and sort of hope at least that the conversation is there, rather than sort of people are hiding the conversation behind a curtain, hoping that no one's going to open it up. But, as I said, I don't have an answer to that. If anybody out there in the comment section has an answer, I'd love to hear it, because that's definitely one of those conversations. But I also want to sort of ask you a question on the topic of deism, because it's very easy to sort of go against the Abrahamic faith and say that, yeah, you can look at these religious texts and point at their historical inaccuracies, point at their philosophical inconsistencies, and say that there's an overwhelmingly unlikely chance that the Abrahamic texts are representative of an actual picture of reality. But what about the topic of deism itself? So, for instance, people often bring up the Kalam cosmological argument to sort of justify the existence of a creator out there. Not necessarily that this creator cares about us, that there's a heaven. None of that is usually associated with this claim, but rather just specifically there's a creator out there, just strictly based on the mathematical unlikelihood that the constants in the universe that rule our universe just so happen to sort of station themselves at the values that they are. So do any of the arguments for a deistic God bring you any pause?
So the place where I am with deism is really that I've never heard a definition of God proposed in a deistic system of belief that is not entirely unfalsifiable and therefore really useless in part of my epistemology, in part of my worldview. If there is some kind of deistic entity, if there's some kind of being that you can propose, some creator being you can propose that isn't inherently unfalsifiable, it's something that we could test for, then I would say, yeah, that sounds like one of the biggest questions in the entire universe. Let's test for that right now. And that's what would probably end up convincing me that there's some kind of like creator being out there. The issue is that I don't think that we actually define a creator being in a way that makes very much sense given what we actually know about cosmology. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever read Carl Sagan's Contact, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but if you haven't read Contact and you don't want a book from, God, when was that released? Like, that was released in the 80s. If I'm spoiling this for you, I'm sorry. Skip to later if you don't want to get this ruined. It's a really great book. That's the only reason why I say that. But at the end of that, I'm sorry if you guys haven't read that and I'm spoiling it for you. But there is a hint at a creator. And the protagonist is a scientist. And the scientist is effectively an atheist, agnostic atheist, essentially, in the same way that Sagan was. It just didn't call himself an atheist. But an agnostic atheist, temporal agnostic, whatever you want to call it, who doesn't see a reason to believe in any of the forms of God that have been proposed by anyone. And she ends up making contact with extraterrestrial beings who have far more scientific knowledge and than humans could ever hope to have in the next 5,000 years. And she says, what inspires awe in you? What gives you pause? And they decide to reveal something about the nature of the universe, but maybe not the nature of the cosmos. And they say that, well, if you calculate pi, the number pi, out far enough, then you see patterns that are basically a signature of a designer. And she's like, wait, what do you mean? How are they a signature of a designer? And she says the alien basically says it's a signature of the beings who created the laws of physics, the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics. They are maybe the creator of the universe. We've never had any contact with them. We've never seen anything but the signature in pi, and there's a few other things that I won't totally spoil. And we think that there may be some kind of creator. The problem is with primitive religions like those of Earth, they define God as something so small and so human that it's almost stupid to even entertain. It's almost insulting to that creator to insinuate that their properties, that their desires are anything similar to our own. And the main character ends up saying, well, you're just telling me, that all this is there, but like, how could I possibly tell that this designer, this creator exists? And so they give her this falsifiable test. They give her this test that says, if you find this in pi and you like basically interpret it this way, if you do this and this thing mathematically, then you'll see these and these results, and that points to a designer. When your computers on your planet get powerful enough to actually make those calculations, do it. When you do it, we'll come back and visit you. So she does it, and it's there. And the thing is that whole book, there are Christians that are telling her the aliens are going to be Jesus Christ. They're going to be Jesus. They're going to be Jesus. You to make sure you don't say anything to the aliens you wouldn't say to Jesus. And what she ends up speaking to is a being that is infinitely lower and less powerful than the creator of the universe. And all of the religious people that she's spoken to up until that meeting have told her that thing is so big that it's the creator of the universe. That this being that she's about to speak to, which isn't the creator, is big enough to be God. And she ends up saying, you've put God in such a tiny, insignificant box that if I thought that a creator could ever be insulted, which is a ridiculous notion, then I think it almost should be. If it had human sensibilities, then this creator would be just shocked and appalled at how tiny religious people act like God is and would be if they existed. And so what she ends up doing is saying, now I have this test, this scientific proof that maybe there is a designer. And so instead of just looking at that little bit of evidence that she has, that number in pi that she ends up finding, it's actually it's a binary code she ends up finding in pi that says certain things. Instead of just getting that message and immediately proclaiming across the entire world and saying God exists, she says, let's search for more evidence, more truth. We need to make sure that every part of our understanding doesn't of this being, of this God, of whatever it is, does not regress to this tiny insignificant box that humans put a creator God in. we need to keep it as big as our actual discoveries, our actual science shows it to be. So for me, I think that all of the ways that a God has been defined so far that I've heard have been unfalsifiable. They've been too small to actually really make any sense. What they need to be is something that we can test for, that we can measure for, and like we can understand to a limited extent, to the point where we know it's there, but it needs to be so ridiculous and beyond our comprehension that we have at least the smallest taste of how powerful it is, while realizing that we probably also don't understand its actual ability, its actual nature, its actual strength. I just don't think that a coherent idea of God that is testable, that could ever be testable like that, has been proposed that I've heard of. Mm-hmm. If there was one, then I'd be like, let's go for it, let's test it. But it's yet to come about. And I'm sure, as you guys know, if something is unfalsifiable, it can't be proven true, it can't be proven false, what is the point of investigating it? There isn't a point. When there is a point, I say, let's go for it, let's do it. But so far, there hasn't been one.
And until we come to that point, it seems like we always have to rely on someone else's interpretation of whatever it is they consider sacred and holy, and end up eating up that as a religious custom or tradition. We know that in Christianity, there's so many different branches and denominations of it, and we know that several of them are because of historical reasons and alterations to the Bible itself that have given theologians pause over the centuries to interpret Christianity in so many different ways. We have Catholicism, when Martin Luther came along and insisted that everyone read the Bible for themselves. It spawned forth an entire slew of Protestant denominations and other theologians like John Calvin and others. Going back on the subject of theology, are theologians necessary? Is it just a form of religious apologism, or are they actually holding us back from a genuinely interesting insight into the philosophy, history, and the ideas of the people from back then?
I think that theology and philosophy should be treated in a way similarly. I think their methodology should be similar. And in certain places, the methodology of this, the study of theology, the study of these texts, or whatever it is somewhat similar to the approaches to philosophical texts. So if you go to Oxford, for instance, where cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor is going to school and taking theology, then you discover something that is, I think, at a lot of points worthwhile in studying, because it teaches you about the philosophy of the past. It teaches you about how human minds tend to be biased in order to come to conclusions and then back them up later with evidence. It's a lesson in confirmation bias. It's a lesson in psychology. It's a lesson in history. It shows us the mistakes of our past so that we hopefully don't repeat them. Now, I think that's a worthwhile endeavor. And I think that philosophy, you could say, is very similar in that. When you study Socrates in a philosophy 101 class, your philosophy teacher is not telling you that, you have to believe what Socrates is saying. Everyone knows Socrates is right, and if you don't agree with him or if you argue against him, then you're going to have to actually go to the principal's office, kind of thing. No, that's not going to happen in a philosophy class. It should be the same way in theology classes. There are certainly institutions that do that just fine, do that well, and are worth keeping around, in my opinion. However, those institutions that do that are absolutely not religious institutions. If you are studying theology in like the school that I went to, which I won't reveal because it's small enough to where you could harass all of my friends and teachers from my school days, not you guys, but people listening. If you study theology there, then if you actually said in that class, we're studying Genesis, and I'm kind of really starting to get the idea that this is non-literal. I think that there's no way that this is something other than a metaphor. This has to be something. Look at the first words that Adam spoke to Eve. They're all poetry. Obviously, this is just like Hebrew mythology mixed with wisdom literature. I think that we should totally look at it that way. But for some reason, we're all creationists. you get thrown out immediately. I mean, you have to sign a statement of faith to go to the school that I went to, and you have to sign a statement of faith to go to a lot of theological schools, like seminaries, for instance. And that doesn't actually incentivize people learning. It incentivizes people coming to conclusions and then learning how to back them up, all the while basically doing an exercise in loyalty for 4 years or however long it takes to get your degree. It's not an intellectual pursuit. It's a tribalistic pursuit. And so that kind of studying of theology absolutely, I think, completely holds us back. I don't think that a lot of our greatest minds and our resources necessarily need to be devoted to studying theology as hard as we might study something like biology. But I do think that it's a worthwhile endeavor to a certain, at least limited extent, in the same way that studying classic literature is. We need to be able to do those things because we need to understand us, where we came from and where we're going, so that we can get to the future we want better. But not all of our resources need to be devoted to that specific field.
Right.
Out of respect for your time, how much longer do we have you for? I don't want to hold you.
I can do another 15 minutes.
Okay.
No problem. Hopefully that's not too short. But
Oh, no, not at all. That's fantastic. Okay, cool. So, do you find appreciation, at least in the literature aspect of religion?
Honestly, I really liked reading the Bible and studying, and I have a minor in Bible from a Christian school, so a lot of that degree is devotional, not academic, unfortunately. I really enjoyed reading the Bible and getting into it growing up. As I became a baby adult, when I got to be about 20, I started to feel like we were repeating a lot of things and I wasn't learning a lot. I felt like I knew the things that the adults around me were trying to tell me to consider important. And eventually, the subject got really, really, really dull. And then I took a poetical books class, which was probably the most academic class that I have, like as in non-devotional. It's not just about loving Jesus, it's about studying Jesus. It was the most non-devotional class that I had in my degree. It was in my senior year, and we studied poetical books. We studied ancient Hebrew wisdom literature that wasn't in the biblical canon, and then we studied some that was. And we discussed how much of it was metaphor, parables, just proverbs, who might have written it, why they wrote it, what the cultural context of that was. And I realized how much the Bible makes sense if you examine it as literature, as something that man wrote, just like man wrote the rest of literature. And that's when the scriptures, that's when really any religious text got not just interesting, but enthralling to me. A lot of people think that I do this because I think that we should just leave religion behind because I don't like religion and I don't care about reading the Bible. I don't care about any of that stuff. No, basically doing not courses in it, but studying religious history and studying just religious studies, the academic study of religion. It's kind of my thing. I'm super into that. That and science fiction are kind of my things. So I love that stuff, but it's only since I started looking at religion as something that was either man-made or was created by some kind of process of natural selection, some kind of Darwinian process, that religion got really, truly fascinating to me. So I'm glad I'm on the other side, because it's almost like I get to look at this thing that was the central component to my entire life for 21 years. And now, I guess 18 years. I received salvation when I was 3. And yeah, I get to look at that and then and see how it affected me when I believed it and I was devoted to it and wouldn't question it. And now I get to look at it from a completely different perspective. And it's interesting because it allows me to understand more about humanity. But it also is almost like holding up a mirror to myself to see who I was in my youth and my adolescence and my young adulthood, and what the growing up of a mind looks like. So for me, just as a personal endeavor, studying religion especially Christianity, but really just about anything else at this point. It's fascinating, incredibly rewarding, and that's why I encourage people. The best thing that you can do as an atheist is go out there and actually study all of these texts and realize how much about human nature these texts tell us and how little about the natural world that they actually convey when they're believed literally.
That's the strange paradox that I also encounter myself with, because religion became infinitely more interesting when I lost my faith. And so much so to the point where I even decided to make religious studies my minor. And it's interesting. I always tell this story because it's a funny story. During the section classes of my religious studies class, I'd always be very combative against sort of liberal interpretations of scripture, because, as I said earlier on in the podcast, I think it's intellectually dishonest to view it that way. And towards the end of the quarter, me and my professor started talking, and he asked me, "Are you a Christian, if you don't mind me asking?" And I was like, "No, I'm a pretty lefty atheist." And he said, like, "I thought you were a right-wing Christian this whole time because of how combative you were against liberal interpretations." So I thought that was pretty funny. Sort of, I want to also open up the conversation about something that we spoke earlier in the podcast, sort of the possibility that religion could be a maladaptation rather than adaptation now. So you've touched on this in your most recent video, in which you liken it to a video game, which is pretty hilarious. Always making it obvious that you're a gamer, which is great. And what I've always sort of had problems with the sort of interpretation that sort of Brett Weinstein sort of proposes, that religion is an adaptation, is that we sort of go into this whole thing that I like to view it as the genetic fallacy, where we assume that religion is still good because it was good in the past. But and you mentioned in your most recent video, when we look at other first world countries such as Sweden, such as Belgium, Norway, the drop in religiosity is associated with the rise in just about every positive metric that you can think of, whether this be life expectancy, whether you think of political polarization. And when meta-analysis of these studies have been conducted, it shows that there's an undeniable link between the drop in religion and the rise in these positive metrics. So do you think that that religion at this point has become a maladaptation, generally speaking?
So I think the first thing I have to clarify is maybe the causal link can run both ways, but I think for the most part, the causal link between prosperity, just general well-being, and being non-religious, I think it runs from the prosperity part toward the non-religious part. Mm-hmm. So basically what I'm saying is, if you become economically and I guess emotionally, relationally prosperous, I think you're more likely to leave religion behind. Mm. So I think it's the prosperity of all of those nations that has probably prompted their atheism, essentially. They're falling away from organized religion. I don't necessarily think that their falling away from organized religion is what has created their prosperity. However, in making progress toward the future, in adopting new progressive policies, those countries are at a huge advantage over those who have different belief systems. So if you look at a country like Iceland, for instance, very, very atheistic, and they were prosperous before they were atheistic. They got very, very rich, and they were very, very Christian. Eventually, they stayed very, very rich, and they stopped being very Christian at all. And now they're one of the nations that's very much threatened by climate change. So what they have done is opted for about, I want to say it's around 75% renewable resources, like 75% of the power that they use, which is a lot, by the way. Icelanders use way more electricity per person than people in the US even. And I mean like nearly 5 times more. They've opted for all renewable resources, just about. There are some cars that, like, obviously they still have gasoline cars, but they mostly use geothermal energy, wind energy, and some solar. And I think that one of the reasons why they are able to do that and just step up, make it happen, is because they got prosperous enough to leave religion, to leave dogma behind to a certain extent, to where when new problems present themselves, they don't have to stay in the mindset of the past that would keep them thinking that they have dominion over the earth because God has ordained them as, whatever, as the pinnacle of all creation. They see themselves as an evolved mammalian ape who's on this spinning ball, and if you don't take care of it, if you affect it, your home in too much and in too strong of a way, if you effectively accidentally terraform this place by all of your activities, then you're going to eat yourself out of house and home, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of a catch-22. It seems that the best thing that you can do to make people atheists is to make them prosperous, if you go by that logic. But it can be really hard to make you prosperous when you're being held back by dogma. So what do? Do you stop the dogma first? Do you go to Ghana in Africa and go around and go, okay, I know that you guys are mostly Christian here, but I'm just letting you know that humanism is the shit and that you need to hold on to this. And your lowlands in Ghana are going to be very much affected by climate change. And if you want to step up and get away from all the Christendom that's keeping your country in danger from climate change, you want to have less of a carbon footprint, less of an impact, you kind of need to become atheist. You need to reframe your whole understanding of your very identity, and then you guys will do way better. They're like, well, we're not prosperous enough, we're not safe enough, secure enough in everything in our lives to actually abandon these structures that give us what we feel like is hope, what we feel like is stability of relationships, stability of society, a moral matrix that we can all plug into. We need that. We need something like that before we can all band together and step up to jump over the big hurdles that we need, like overcoming climate change. Mm-hmm. I don't know that you could step into Ghana and tell them that they need to leave religion behind and it would actually work. Now, I think if you were able to somehow plant someone who would become the next billionaire in Ghana, who brought up the GDP of the country tremendously, then I think you could get to the point where less people are religious and then they tackle climate change just fine. The issue is making people economically prosperous seems like it would be a whole lot harder than making people ideologically progressive, but it almost seems like the inverse is true.
Right. As someone from the United States, why do you think the United States is the only first world country that is predominantly religious?
So this takes a little bit to explain. I'll try to give a short version, but essentially I think that the reason why we are more religious is because we had the first secular constitution, like truly secular constitution, and a lot of resources for people to use in spreading those, in spreading religious ideas. Essentially, what I'm saying is the U.S. is a free market for religious ideas, and to a certain extent, free markets kind of make economic exchanges go crazy, and a lot of the time bring prosperity, at least to a certain few. And if you have a completely closed down market, if you have a government controlling all of the resources, all of the means of production, then you end up not having as much creativity. You don't have as much motivation to innovate. You don't have as much individuality that's expressed. And so I really think that, like, the UK, for instance, becoming very atheistic, probably going to be one of the most atheistic groups of countries in the world in 20 years, if it's not already just about there. They have a state church. They don't allow you to, or they haven't historically at least, allowed you to start your own religious group in order to spread your ideas if you have them, and allow people who would take on those ideas to latch on and help you grow. They don't allow you to have free exchange within the marketplace of ideas, at least when it comes to religion, because they have an established church. Now, the U.S. is more free market when it comes to religion. You can start a church about Fonzie from Happy Days if you want. You can literally get that tax-free if you do all the paperwork right. And so people are like, you know what? I do want to make a religion surrounding Fonzie, or around golden plates that I found in my backyard, or surrounding, I don't know, what's the Jehovah's Witness founding myth that we have end times predictions, or whatever it may be. People can start their own, and religions can innovate, can exchange, and have security in doing so. in the US. You don't have that in places like Western Europe, or at least you haven't historically. And so I think that's why a lot of ideas, religious ideas, have propagated and spread throughout the US, but not necessarily Western Europe.
All right. Any closing questions, Bruce?
Yeah, Drew. There's one last question I want to run past you, and it's a little bit of a difficult one, but concerns the the whole regressive woke, whatever we want to call it, movement that's really split the community as a whole. In particular, with the conversation regarding Islam. Now, we seem to have tentatively turned the corner on that particular subject, and people seem to be much more able to discuss that subject directly without having a fatwa declared on them, like what happened to Salman Rushdie years ago.
Right.
But there are a lot of incidences that have happened lately that have just really given me pause on just how much we progressed as a society. Stephen was really blasted by the ACA a few years ago for his commentary on transgender competition in sports. With COVID-19 on the horizon, and I've started seeing stirrings of enforced speech and how people want to leave out references to China when it comes to holding them account for the coronavirus. But it really strikes me is how people still don't seem to understand the difference between criticizing people and ideas. And this is a demonstration, to me at least, of how people are willing to discard nuance for virtue signaling, which is in and out of itself a rejection of critical thinking. We're in the 21st century now, and we really need to get those critical thinking faculties to really going to really push forward for a more humanistic future. And I just don't see us getting there if this continues. We're still pushing back on fundamentalist Christianity here in the States, and we have these quote-unquote pseudo-progressives block discussions on Islam because of political correctness. And I can see the same thing happening crossing over into a discussion about Hinduism if we turn our attention to the Hindutva in India, and eventually we'll probably have to. How do you see the movement moving forward in a true progressive fashion that's consistent with liberal and humanistic values, free speech, women's rights, gay rights, moving forward to a colorblind society? Like, how do we move forward in an intellectually and ethically honest fashion towards that future that we all want?
Realistically, if we start taking steps toward that, I think it's going to be less about the adults that are already in power people that are already at the tops of platforms, that are sitting on platforms that exchange ideas in our marketplace of ideas. I don't think we're necessarily going to change the minds of a lot of adults. And I don't think that a lot of people are going, like, that are speaking against Islamophobia or are upholding political correctness over actual human rights issues. I don't think we're necessarily going to change their minds particularly quickly, or maybe even at all. I think that what we may end up doing is essentially voting them out of power by changing the minds and influencing the minds of younger people who are just starting to have these discussions, because the adults that are making a lot of the decisions in the world, like policy decisions, they're not influenced by modern communication. They're influenced by still the pre-internet age in which they grew up, or at least a lot of them are. They're being influenced by a less global society. They're being influenced by, I don't want to say less communication that was of lower quality necessarily, because the internet can facilitate very poor quality conversations, very poor quality dialogue.
Yeah.
But they saw a more limited perspective in their day, in their formative years. Generation Z is not forming in an insulated, coddled bubble of a world. They're growing up in a world that's more interconnected than anyone could have possibly imagined even 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. I mean, I posted 3 videos on TikTok earlier today, having never used TikTok before, and I have like 3,000 views on there, and no one even knows that I did it. Like, and they're all, like, most of them are younger. So I think what's going to end up happening is if we can inspire a cultural revolution, essentially, not like this big loud revolution that is people, storming the front gates of embassies and storming the White House literally, or something like that. I think it's going to be, we are quietly infiltrating sounds really dirty. But we're quietly influencing the culture in a way that allows us to take on the global perspectives that we're constantly just like bombarded with if we're on the internet, and put them in perspective in an ethical, humanistic way, compassionate way. I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to inspire people to use critical thinking, but the whole point of people using critical thinking skills in order to make policy is so that we can actually uphold human rights and champion the well-being of all humans the best that we possibly can. I think that if we make it cool enough that in doing that, to hold those ideas, I think younger people will kind of change their minds, and they will do what millennials have done in our time, in theirs. So that said, I think that this is a long battle. This is not something that we're not going to eliminate woke culture and PC culture within, the next 5 years necessarily.
Right.
But we may seriously damage that kind of thinking or put a damper on that kind of thinking within the next generation. The really moral dilemma that I think all three of us are in is how can we best use our platforms, our influence, our voices to create that culture that will take up the reins when I can no longer hold them. That's what we're doing. Right. And so I think that if you're someone that's listening to this, or you create content like mine or the content of these guys, if you like to have these conversations at all, I think what you have to realize is that your main influence is going to be over future generations, and is not so much going to be against your interlocutor that you may be opposing right now in this moment. So realize that's where your responsibility lies, and do what you will with your platform, always understanding that that's where your responsibility lies.
Slowly melting that glacier.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Drew, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you and have this conversation. So thanks for coming on. It's been great.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a blast. Great questions, challenging questions, guys. I am incredibly glad that I got to make it onto the podcast.
Oh, well, it's an absolute honor to hear that. So everyone go ahead and check out Genetically Modified Skeptic's channel. He's genuinely a beacon of hope in this landscape that we like to call the political conversation. It's just miseries. But everyone, thanks for coming on. Thanks for listening. Yes, Bruce?
And just as a final plug, I had the pleasure of meeting Drew just completely out of the blue about a year and a half ago. Generally one of the nicest people I've ever met, and from our conversations, including this one, very, very intellectually sharp, and just has a lot to offer everyone who listens to his channel. So if you're not a patron already, get on there and support him. We can use all the help you can get.
Well, thank you, and I would say the same about the both of you. I'm impressed with the podcast. I think you guys can go far with this. You both deserve more credit than you're getting right now, and I hope that you get there.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and plug our merch that we now officially have, Thinking Out Loud mugs. So
there we go.
Yeah, look at that. But yeah, again, thanks for coming to the podcast. It's absolutely great. Everyone go subscribe to Genetically Modified Skeptic. Go become a Patreon, and go buy his merch. So see you next time, guys. Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking Out Loud. Be sure to follow me on Twitter @LatentPhysicist, as well as on Instagram @PlayEdson2019. If you're interested in merch, check out the link in the description of the video below. And as always, hope to see you in the next video.